Today I want to talk about Oozemancer and how I beat insane roguelike difficulty with it. In the first part of the video, I'll go over all of Oozemancer's talents, and the second one, I'll show you the character that I beat the game with and talk you through leveling, Prodigy's gear, and the way I understand Oozemancer, because this is a class that plays very different to how I thought it would, based on facing it in the hands of the AI. Oozemancer is a mind power, anti-magic, damage over time caster, and I surprisingly found it to be best at longer range, like 7-ish tiles. The advantage of this class is that if the enemy does close the gap or pull you in, you don't have to run, or at least not very far, because Oozemancer is extremely tanky and also has a lot of powerful close range talents. In fact, for maximum damage, you would want to stand right next to the enemies, but obviously that's also where it's the most dangerous. You could also build Oozemancer more melee focused and hit enemies with your side blades. It has talents that synergize with that. Overall, it's a completely unique, genius design, as are most of Tom's classes, and I can't wait to tell you more about it, but first, let's talk about Equilibrium, the resource for all of Oozemancer's talents. This is a resource that increases as you use your talents, and when your equilibrium becomes higher than your willpower, you start getting a percentage chance to fail using your talents. This is why it's my least favorite resource, because this is extremely punishing and frustrating if you can't manage it well, as you end up skipping every other turn. Thankfully though, Oozemancer has a lot of equilibrium reduction built into it, so it's less of a problem on this class. Let's begin with Slime and Slime Spit. There are a lot of slimes in Tome, so this talent should be very familiar to you. It's a 10 range chaining projectile that damages and applies a 30% slow to anything it hits. There are two downsides to this. First, it's a projectile and with only 600% of base speed, which basically means enemies will usually get to move a tile before the projectile arrives, so it's not difficult to miss. The second problem is your oozes block the projectile. You can slime spit them anyways, and it will chain through them onto the enemies, but killing your own oozes is not ideal. Still, this is one of Oozemancer's few upfront damaging talents, and the slow is great, so you'll use this talent a lot. Poisonous Spores is a range 10, crit friendly, small AoE damage over time talent that also applies one of 4 poisons. These can either pin, reduce healing, give a chance to fail talents, or reduce damage dealt. All of these are very useful, although the pin and the healing reduction only against certain enemies. You might think dealing damage over 10 turns is a lot in Tome, especially in late game combat, but Oozemancer plays a bit of a different game from everyone else, so this is decent later on once you get your crit chance up. It's important to note that this, and many other talents of Oozemancer's, are a poison, so some base type enemies, like undead, elementals or constructs, which are completely immune to poison, do not get affected by this at all. What this means is that you should be careful about heavily investing into these poison talents too early, because then you might run into enemies against which your character is just completely useless. Acidic Skin costs 3 equilibrium to sustain, and it retaliates on attacks with Disarming Acid. What does that mean exactly? Well, I'm not sure why this isn't explained in game, but if you look at the wiki, you can see a list of what all these cryptic special damage types do. Disarming Acid specifically gives 25% chance to disarm. So it's only okay at best, but since it's pretty much free, there's not much reason to complain. Slime Roots is a teleport, but unfortunately it's one of those that requires some investment to make it reliable, and I feel like 3 points is a sweet spot, 6 range and 2 error margin felt pretty good to me. There's also the second part that resets the cooldown of a random talent, and there is clearly some combo potential here if you only use one specific talent at the beginning of combat, but honestly, I don't think it's worth it. I much prefer just saving this as a decent escape talent and ignoring this text. Mucus is where things get interesting, as it's an instant speed talent that leaves green mucus around you every turn. This is what the AI Oozemancer's often try to kill you with, and I expected to primarily use this for damage. And because it stacks, on top of itself, it does do tons of damage. So if some unique decides to rush towards you, it's going to regret it. But Mucus is actually best at reducing your equilibrium. So more important than enemies standing in your Mucus is you and your summons standing in the Mucus. You want to get this to the increased area threshold very early, as this is an absolutely key part of Oozemancer. To help spread Mucus everywhere, there's Acid Splash, which puts it down in a 2 radius area and deals a bit of acid damage. Oozemancer does both nature and acid damage, and you can later specialize in either one, but most of the good talents are nature, so that's what you're likely going to scale. So the acid talents should mainly just be used for their effects. It is useful to make Acid Splash have 3 radius instead of 2 radius, but I don't think it's worth 3 extra points. Living Mucus passively gives you a chance to spawn Mucus Oozes on your Mucus. You get 4 maximum Oozes at 75 cunning and 5 at 100 cunning, and they basically last an infinite amount of time because you prolong their life each time you crit. They are not very tanky and they don't deal much damage, but they help reduce your equilibrium and they constantly get in the way of enemies, so this is a beautiful cheap talent. Ooze Walk is another teleport. This one is 10 range and accurate, but conditional. To use it, you need to be standing on the Mucus and target an empty Mucus tile. But for that, it also cleanses physical or magical debuffs and is even used faster than your usual talents, so that is very good. It's perfect for dealing with getting teleported or pulled in, since you should always turn Mucus on at the beginning of a fight, which drops at your feet where you are standing, so Ooze Walk just lets you teleport right back. Or, since you have Slime Roots as another teleport, you don't have to be afraid to just use this to cleanse debuffs. In Ooze, there is Mitosis, which is the class-defining talent. This is where the majority of Oozemancer's tankiness comes from. It is a sustain that gives you a chance to spawn bloated oozes based on the percentage of health you lost. You then equally share any damage you take with your bloated oozes. So yes, this means you have 50% damage reduction as long as a bloated ooze is alive. That's pretty good. The description says they are very resilient, which is sort of true. Trash mobs and some rares might struggle a bit, but at least on Insane, enemies scale hard enough that especially later on, it's not uncommon for the oozes to get one shot. But still, they take time to get through, and as long as at least one is alive, you are not dying. Reabsorb gives you 40% all resistance for sacrificing an adjacent bloated ooze. This can last for up to 9 turns. This talent is completely insane. It just caps all your resists for the whole fight. Or at least that's how it looks at first glance. Unfortunately, the shocking reality is that this talent is actually not very good. How is that possible? Well, the all resistance buff that Reabsorb gives is the exact same as the all resistance buff that a Wild Infusion gives you. So if you use a Wild Infusion after your Reabsorb, your 7-turn 40% all resist buff will get replaced by the 23% 2-turn all resist buff. Oozemancer is also anti-magic by default, so you can't use Shatter Affliction runes. This really sucks. You can't not use your debuff cleanses, and you can't control when powerful debuffs are applied to you. So you are killing one of your bloated oozes, which is not that small of a price to pay for a gamble on how long you get the 40% buff. So I don't think this is worth any extra points. I made the mistake of getting it to the 7-turn duration, and after I understood this interaction with Wild Infusions, I regretted it. It can still situationally be useful, especially early game where your resists are low, but 1 point should be enough for that. Call of the Ooze is probably the best talent of Oozemancer. It forcibly summons the bloated oozes so that you can start each fight with that 50% damage reduction instead of waiting until you get hit. The oozes also immediately taunt enemies and even project a melee attack as acid damage through them, so this talent just does everything. You want this and Mitosis quickly maxed. Indiscernible Anatomy passively gives you immunities to disease, poison, bleed, blind, and some crit shrug off, which means a chance to ignore the bonus damage from critical hits, but you still take the base damage. So this is all really good. The immunities are not the most important ones, but it's still a really good deal to get 4 at the same time, and not getting crit is extremely valuable. You should aim to max this after your core talents. Moss is a tree with 4 very similar talents. They are all instant speed and grow moss in a radius around you that does a bit of damage and has some effect. Unfortunately, you can't drop all the mosses at the same time, as using one puts the other 3 on a 3-turn cooldown. Grasping moss slows and pins enemies. This is the least impressive one, mostly useful in the early game, where a lot of the melee enemies don't have any gap closers. Nourishing moss heals you for the damage done, and this can heal a lot if you are surrounded, but since you are anti-magic, you are heavily incentivized to run a regeneration infusion, so I didn't feel like I needed this too much. The last 2 mosses are really good though. Slippery moss gives enemies a chance to skip their turns, which should end up healing you more than nourishing moss, and hallucinogenic moss has a chance to inflict confusion on enemies, which is very similar to slippery moss, but a little worse, since it first has a percentage chance to apply, whereas slippery moss works always. Obviously these talents only work in close-ish range, but they are extremely powerful, and at least the 2 last mosses are worth investing into eventually. Then there are 3 locked class categories: Oozing Blades, which has Ooze Beam, a range 10, 3-turn cooldown beam. This type of talent is the bread and butter of any caster class. It does slime damage, which is nature damage, but it also always applies a 15% slow. You want to spend your very first category point here and get this talent, because it makes getting through the early game so much easier, and it stays relevant for the entire game. Natural Acid is a passive that gives you a lot of nature resistance and increases your nature damage when you hit with acid. It doesn't scale with points too well, but for 1 or 2 points it's alright. Mind Parasite puts random talents on cooldown, and it's the type of talent that can absolutely cripple the player, but has questionable impact against the AI, since they can have multiple classes and end up with a lot more talents than you. This also needs a bit of investment to even make it worth casting, and Oozemancer does not have that many spare class points, so I think it's best to just ignore this talent. Unstoppable Nature is a sustain that solves all your nature resistance penetration problems. The rest you'll just pick up naturally, since modifiers that give increased nature damage also often give a bit of penetration. The extra Mucus Ooze spits are okay, so if you're lazy like me, just max this, or if you want to maybe save a point or 2, this is the place to float your class points, since you might end up with too much resistance penetration. Corrosive Blades is almost the same tree, but for acid. So you can guess what Acid Beam does, and what's funny is that here it doesn't say it does disarming acid damage, it does acid damage, open brackets, that can disarm them, close brackets. Still doesn't tell you the percentage, unfortunately, but it's 25%. I like this effect a lot more than the 15% slow, because you already have access to a 30% slow through Slime Spit. You could possibly get both these trees and just spam beams 2 out of every 3 turns. Corrosive Nature is the acid version of Natural Acid, a bit of acid resistance and increased acid damage. Corrosive Seeds is different, but not much better. It's a weird AoE that needs the enemies to step on specific tiles, and from my experience, those type of talents are just frustrating to use in Tome, and it's just not needed. AoE is not what Oozemancer struggles with. And Acidic Soil gives you plenty of acid resistance penetration and massively increases the health regen of your bloated oozes, which is really nice. So the support to use both nature and acid damage is here, but you will still need to focus your damage increases on just one of them, so I still think it is difficult to justify, especially because the next log tree is Eyal's Fury. Reclaim is supposed to be the answer against all those poison immune enemies, but it is single target, only range 7, and does split damage types that are added together only a little bit higher than the beams. So are you really going to invest into this to then only use it against the poison immune enemies? I don't think so. Nature's Defiance passively gives you spell save, arcane resist, and nature affinity. That's all very mediocre, but it also gives you a pretty sizable equilibrium reduction every turn when you take damage from spells, so it's decent for a point. Acid Fire is the one really good acid talent. It's a big AoE damage over time cloud that has a chance to blind and burn away magical sustains or buffs. It stacks your natural acid, the nature damage increase when you deal acid damage by itself, has a powerful effect, and it's great for pulling enemies from around the corner, and it's extremely cheap, since if you don't care about the damage, the duration doesn't scale, the blind chance doesn't scale, so you get so much for only a point. And later, you can definitely invest a bit more since +5, +4%, and even the damage increase is respectable. And finally, Eyal's Wrath is a centered on you, massive, long-lasting AoE that deals nature damage every turn and drains resources from any filthy arcane users, which then also reduces your equilibrium. This is the real anti-poison immune enemy talent, because it just does straight up damage, and guess what? It also works just as well against any other enemy. And if anything has mana, vim, or energy, it will keep your equilibrium nice and low, so I like maxing this, it's just an awesome talent. On the generic side, there's the common survival with 1.0 mastery, and I want to mention the Vice Mastery, which I found really useful on Oozemancer. You are anti-magic, so your gearing is a bit more limited, and I ended up using a bunch of items with active abilities, and this talent really shines in such a situation, so don't sleep on it. And of course Track lets you see enemies through walls, which makes it one of the best talents in the game. In Call of the Wild, there is Meditation. This is what some unfortunate wilder classes have to rely on to reduce their equilibrium, and it is torture. Other than that, this also increases your healing factor, so if you are going to use some heals, since Meditation is instant speed, you should just turn it on. The downside is you are going to forget to turn it off and then wonder why you suddenly deal no damage. Don't worry, nothing is wrong with you. That happens to everyone. Or, well, at least it still happens to me. Nature's Touch is a heal that can crit, so even for a few points, it stays relevant-ish for the entire game. The best part about it is that you can use it on any target, so you can use this to heal escorts if you forget to save a totem of healing. Earth's Eyes is as close to useless as you can get in a world where Track exists, and Nature's Balance lets you reset the cooldown of your wild gifts, which is pretty much any of your talents. This is best used on talents like Eyal's Wrath that have really long cooldowns. There's just one problem with this. I'm no longer sure what tier means. I previously thought it's just based on the position of the talent, so if it's first, second or fourth in the tree, but that does not seem to be the case. You would think it's just the talent level, but that also does not seem to always work. So it's a bit of a mystery. You just put points into it until the talent you want gets its cooldown reset. Oozemancer is the only class that starts anti-magic. Resolve is an amazing passive that gives you a lot of resistance for up to 3 different non-physical or mind damage types that are hitting you, and it even reduces your equilibrium. Get 3 points here as soon as possible. Anti-Magic Zone silences enemies and burns their arcane resource. Obviously amazing for shutting down mages, but what's interesting about Oozemancer is that because you have so many summons, you can actually use this to reduce your equilibrium, because you can just silence all of your oozes, which they don't care about because they don't use spells. Antimagic Shield is a sustain that gives you flat damage reaction against non-physical and non-mind damage, and it is extremely good. The downside is that it's expensive to sustain and it increases your equilibrium as it reduces damage, so you usually can't turn it on in the very early game. I also don't think it's worth investing in too much. 1 or 2 points should be enough, because Oozemancer is already built to deal with mages, so that's never how you're going to die. The real danger is, as per usual, physical damage. Mana Clash burns a lot of arcane resources and damages the enemy based on how much it burned. There are 2 very important extra parts to this talent. Firstly, this is a talent that has a negative equilibrium cost, so it reduces your equilibrium, meaning it can sometimes be useful to just cast this on the floor to reduce your equilibrium. The other important part is that after you kill Orcus, the anti-magic leader in Ziggur will promote you to a higher rank, which will make Mana Clash also strip 4 magical sustains, making it even better. But I also think just a point here is enough for the same reasons as with the shield. Oozemancer also starts with Mindstar Mastery, and this gives you Blades, which is a sustain that makes your Mindstars into pretty much the best melee weapons in the game. But if you are not melee attacking, investing into this talent only gives you the mind power, willpower, and cunning bonus on Mindstars. Exactly how much value this has will highly depend on the Mindstars you find. As an example, the Mindstars that I killed the final boss with gave me 0 cunning, 6 willpower, and 43 mind power. The first point in Blades increases those to 9 willpower and 62 mind power. With 5 points, I would get 11 willpower and 82 mind power. Admittedly, I had bad luck and my Mindstars were, I would say, below average, but still, I don't value investing into Blades too highly on casters. Thorn Grab is an instant speed, melee range talent that applies a small nature damage over time and a decently sized slow. Not much downside to using it when something closes the gap, but I don't think it's worth point investment. Leaves Tide applies stacking bleed in radius 3, and more importantly, gives all allies in that radius, including you, a percentage chance to avoid all damage. It is possible to get this to around 50% with high mind power and good mind stars, but even with lower values, this is still great, as it lasts for 7 turns. It's more than worth it. Nature's Equilibrium is a hard-hitting melee attack that also heals and reduces equilibrium if you use the heal on yourself, which you probably will. The way I played Oozemancer, I found no use for this, as I had better ways to heal, but if you are going to max Blades, you will get use out of this talent. Notably, you can hit your own oozes for the heal. And the last category, Fungus, is locked, but please don't ever spend a category point on it, because after Orcus and your promotion, Fungus will unlock for free. Wild Growth passively increases your maximum life and life regen, and with some willpower by pretty significant amounts. So you shouldn't feel bad for spending 3-ish points or even maxing it. Fungal Growth increases the duration of your regenerations, and one good candidate for this is a Regeneration Infusion. With some mind power and investment, you can have a single Regeneration Infusion permanently running, giving you like 250 life regeneration every single turn. I think that's very much worth the investment. Ancestral Life passively lets your regeneration reduce your equilibrium a bit each turn, and then you also get some speed when you non-regeneration heal, but since overhealing doesn't count, you need to take a lot of damage first, which you should try really hard to avoid, but it could help you stabilize potentially, but it's so niche that it's just a one-pointer. Sudden Growth heals you for X times your life regeneration, and the problem with this is that as long as your regeneration infusion is running, you are unlikely to need this heal, and in a world where you use a lot of infusions, so you get a high infusion saturation, which increases the cooldown on your infusions, which will make you have downtime on your regeneration infusion, this talent will be horrible, as the heal will be tiny. So I do not like this talent very much. So here's my guy, straight from the final boss. These are the add-ons that I use, none of them affect gameplay, and yet again, I would recommend Plenum Tooltip Custom Edit, at least considering it, because on Oozemancer, you want to know if enemies are poison immune, and usually what you would have to do is go inspect creature, defense, and look at the immunities, but with the Tooltip add-on, all you have to do is hold shift when you hover over an enemy, and you will see the immunities on the right side, right under the resistances. So this saves a lot of time, and it's just very useful. As per usual, I've uploaded my playthrough through High Peak and the final boss, without any commentary, just if you want to see how the class plays, and that's linked in the description. And now, before I forget, I have to mention combat training. Oozemancer does not start with this category, but you still obviously want thick skin, so you have to go to Last Hope and then talk to any of the vendors. I think it costs like 20 or 30 gold to learn this category, so don't forget about that. As I've mentioned at the beginning of the video, the way I built Oozemancer is to be comfortable staying at long range and just continuously firing off the beam and the other long range spells. I basically never tried to hack enemies to deal damage to them through Mucus. In fact, the only time I did that was on Elandar, on the final boss. And I think this approach works really well. There's not really any reason to rush into melee. So let's have a deeper look, starting with the stats. Here it's very simple. You max out willpower first, because it powers up all your talents, it increases your equilibrium threshold, so it's clearly the best. Second, I think cunning makes the most sense, as if there is one weakness that Oozemancer has, it is lower damage, so being able to crit is very useful. And for the third stat, I maxed out Constitution to increase my healing modifier and get some extra maximum life. And then the final points, I just put into Dexterity for the critical shrug-off, since you already get a lot of crit shrug-off from Indiscernible Anatomy. With the willpower I managed to get to 75% to ignore any bonus damage from crits. For my race, I decided to go for a dwarf, and it took me a while to come to a decision on which race to play. Obviously some of the usual best races are not an option, like Shalor, because you are anti-magic, and Shalor's talents are spells. So the way I saw it is that I could go Thalor, which is the kind of boring option. You get some all resist, you get the treants, it's just alright. Then I thought about Krog, because Krog has a talent that lets you apply stun, which you don't have access to on Oozemancer. So I thought that's an interesting option, but ultimately I decided against it, since I did not really want to spend that much time in melee. You don't really have to with Krog, but it seemed to me like that would be an option for a more melee-focused Oozemancer. And then there's obviously Drem with Frenzy, which lets you reset the cooldown of your class talents. And Drem would definitely be really good. You could reset Ael's Wrath, Acid Fire, Call of the Ooze, like many good talents that would work really well with Drem, so that's definitely a great option. But ultimately, none of the opportunity cost felt that great, so I decided, why not go for Dwarf? If I am going to be spending a long time in combat, and it's going to really drag on, well, that sounds like a good reason to have really high saves, and to become highly resistant to debuffs. So even though there is no other talent that really gives you a lot of saves, I thought why not, let's give it a try. The other talents in Dwarf are whatever. Resilience of the Dwarfs, you put a point here, and then you can put it on autocast when enemies are adjacent to you, and it gives you some saves, a bit of armor. Stone Skin is actually pretty good, it gives you a 15% chance to just not take damage from melee attacks. And then obviously Power is Money gives you a lot of saves. The only downside is that you have to keep 3000 gold, which is really not that much. Now it would mean like 1 or 2 extra rerolls, so it's basically free. And then the last talent, Stonewalking, lets you teleport through walls, and it's so niche that I don't think it's even worth a point. And then the other advantage of Dwarf is that you don't get any experience penalty, and you get 2 starting dungeons, so you get a pretty massive head start on experience. So overall, I am pretty satisfied with Dwarf. Drem is probably better, but the saves managed to stay relevant. I maxed this out around the first Prodigy, and basically from that point on, I had at least like a 40-50% chance to resist any debuff, And against some enemies, some classes, even if they're a unique, they might not have that much power. So saves are definitely not worthless on Insane. Right now I have them all at 62, 77, 88, but this is without Resilience of the Dwarfs, which now improves my 2 worst ones. And ideally, like with the powers, you would get your saves to 100, all of them, but this requires some heavy investment through your gear. This is enough for it to be relevant. The leveling process is fairly straightforward. You rely on Slime Spit in the very early game, and then as soon as you hit level 10, unlocking Ooze Blades and maxing out your Ooze Beam, and that's kind of your offense for a long while. So you then focus on your defenses with Mitosis and Call of the Ooze, get your nature penetration through Unstoppable Nature, and then once you hit level 34, you rush to Eyal's Fury or Eyal's Wrath, and then you also need 4 points in Mucus to make it Radius 2. And once you have all that, you're pretty much good to go. Then you finish up all the rest of the talents, Indiscernible Anatomy to not get crit, but from that point on, you're insanely powerful. I only invest into the most talents at the very end with my last few points, because again with my playstyle, I usually don't spend time in range 4, and the most talents are pretty expensive, like they require a decent amount of points, so I only had time for them at the very end. On the generic side, you just really want to get Resolve to 3 points as soon as possible. You need a point in heavy armor training so that you can equip heavy gauntlets and helmets and stuff like that. I ended up not using any of these in my final build, but you will definitely use them throughout the game. Also, if you go Dwarf, you want to put a point into Danger Sense, since this gives you an additional roll to try and resist a debuff, although at a very heavy disadvantage. I think it's still worth it. And my only regret is that I did not put more points into Device Mastery. Probably could have cut 2-3 points from Leaf's Tide and put them here, since I ended up using a lot of active items. But more on that later. Let's first talk about Prodigies, because, well, there's a lot to talk about. So, as my first Prodigy, I took Windtouched Speed. This gives you global speed, which feels really nice, you don't have access to it anywhere else. And you get 10% cooldown reduction, which always rounds down. So for example, the Ooze Beam usually has a 3-turn cooldown. Once you take this Prodigy, it only has a 2-turn cooldown. So it is actually more impactful on your short cooldown talents than on the one that have a really long cooldown. Also, this cooldown reduction on Windtouched Speed also works on things like your Inscriptions. So you see here my Movement Infusion only has 7 turns of cooldown. And this matters. A single turn on your Inscriptions can be the difference between life and death. The only downside to this Prodigy is that since you will not be taking Dexterity, at least not until your last stat, you need to save up gear to get 50 Dexterity, which is pretty annoying, but once you have enough, you put all the gear that has plus 6 dex, plus 4 dex, you put it all on, you click on Windtouched Speed, and then you can put on your normal gear, let your Dexterity drop below 50. I mean, you see right now, I have less than 50 Dexterity, but the Prodigy will continue working. You might ask, why not go Adept? Adept is, from what I've seen, definitely the most popular first Prodigy, and what it does is just makes everything about your character a little better. My opinion on Adept is that it's always decent, but very rarely I think it is the best option. Usually the only time I consider it is if it gives you some kind of new threshold. So for example, on Doomed, it lets you summon an extra shadow, which is a key part of that class, so taking Adept makes a lot of sense. An easy way I recently found to check how exactly Adept will affect your character is to go to Tome Tips, then you find your talent, and then change the mastery to 1.6. And this works because 5 points with 1.3 mastery plus Adept is the same talent level as 5 points with 1.6 mastery. On a class like Oozemancer, it doesn't really give you any new thresholds. It doesn't let you summon more Oozes, it gives you some extra duration on like your most talents, or maybe your Eyal's Wrath. It makes it all deal a bit more damage, it improves all your equilibrium regeneration, but I didn't really find any talent that it drastically improved. Now on generics, it would save me points, because for example, I would only need 2 points into Resolve to hit that threshold to get 3 bonus resistances. I wouldn't need as many points in Nature's Balance, and it would just make everything better. Adept is good, it's definitely good, and it feels really good to take it, but I think Windtouched speed is just better. I felt like acting more often and getting my talents off cooldown more often, even if they are weaker, will give me more value than going Adept. And then as my second Prodigy, I decided to take Meteoric Crash, because I've never really experimented with it much, and I wanted to give it a shot, and I decided for it because it is upfront damage, and it's a stun, which I can't apply, and it does no damage to allies, so all my oozes would be safe, and it copies your damage bonus and damage penetration from your highest element, so that would be nature, and it is pretty good. It's alright. It is exactly what I expected, and it did its job well enough. I didn't really need any of the prodigies that help you deal with debuffs, since I had high saves, and just in general, defense wasn't really a problem. And in terms of offensive prodigies, the other option would be something like Eye of the Tiger, that helps you cool down your talents, but for that I already had Windtouched speed, and basically every single turn I had a good talent to use, so I didn't see a reason for this. The other option would be Master of Disasters, that just gives you a huge power increase, and I would put this Prodigy on a similar level as Adept. Like, it's always decent, more power is always good, and this also lets you apply the cross tier effects, which are pretty decent, but honestly I don't regret it. I think Meteoric Crash really is just pretty good. It's like taking Windblade or Vital Shot on a weapon class. So I'm officially apologizing to Meteoric Crash. I did underestimate it, partly because I didn't read it correctly when I did the Prodigy tier list, and partly because I just didn't really see a good reason to take it, but here on Oozemancer, I think it's pretty much perfect. I have to say, for a class that has, I think, the highest win rate, I was surprised at just how, not difficult, but how much effort I had to put into the early game to survive. Because the tier 1 dungeons, sure, you have a beam, that's pretty much enough to get through tier 1 dungeons, but then it felt like my power dipped down a lot, and it can especially be felt if you run into enemies that cannot be poisoned. And I had multiple, very extremely close calls. Some of them were my mistake, where I just took really stupid fights because I felt like I can win them, and I did, although barely. And with some of them, like with Celia, I just decided to stand right next to her to apply Mucus to her. But it also meant I tanked every single skeleton, every single ghoul, all her summons. I just stood there and tanked them, which turned out to not be the best idea, and I almost paid for that with my life. Now, to be fair, I had Blood of Life in all of these clips, and I would be able to run away, but still, like, it didn't feel entirely under control. And this went on until level 34, where you pick up Ael's Wrath, and then it felt like the power level again picked up massively, and by the end game, I felt pretty much unstoppable. You are stupidly tanky, and like, you don't have insane damage, but you have enough damage to eventually kill everything. And in the background right now, there's a clip where it was the entrance to one of the prides, and I fought like 3 random bosses and like countless rares, and I took all of them on at once. And I don't think I ever dropped below like 60-70% HP, because I had some like downtime where my regeneration infusion wasn't up because I was using a lot of inscriptions. But you just have so many defensive cooldowns. The regeneration infusion, then the psionic shield, then Call of the Ooze, and one of these is pretty much always up, so you're just really, really difficult to kill. And the majority, pretty much all of your damage is AoE, so it does not really matter how many enemies you face. They will all slowly die. Also, a part of why the mid-game is difficult is that that's really the only part of the game where you experience equilibrium problems, and this obviously makes your character a lot weaker, since even with like a 15% chance to fail your talents, it's just really bad. But as you can see by the end game, your equilibrium basically stays at the minimum value the entire time. The one downside to Oozemancer is that every time you fight, since you summon oozes all over the place, it is difficult to pull enemies precisely. Oftentimes, you aim to pull like a unique and a rare, and then you end up fighting the entire dungeon. This is especially a problem if you get caught by an orc patrol, which has not happened to me in a very long time, but I was a little impatient, and I managed to get myself cornered between 2 orc patrols, and I was pretty damn close to dying. I did not think I could win that fight, so I attempted to run away, and I just about managed to cleanse all my debuffs with the help of Relentless Pursuit, but that was definitely a scary moment, so I added it here just to remind you to not get lazy, and if you see a bunch of orc patrols, just walk away, run up and down 50 times somewhere else, and then come back. It's not worth trying to sneak past them, it's not worth losing your level 50 character. Also, even though you start Antimagic, you still need to do the Antimagic Trials, and I did this at I think like level 17. The only really dangerous enemy is the very final one, which is like an orc shaman that has Bone Shield and does a bunch of blight damage. But the good news is, you don't need to rush with this. This doesn't really give you anything. It improves your anti-magic by 0.1 mastery, which is pretty much useless. So you only need this before you want to kill Urkis. So in theory, if you've not done this before and you don't have a good feeling about if your character is powerful enough, you can delay this before you go to kill Urkis. So for my inscriptions, I ran a movement infusion, a regen infusion that is permanently up, so I ended up with plus 270 life every turn, which pretty much keeps me at full health all the time. Then 2 wild infusions, since you need some way to deal with debuffs. So this one is physical, and this one is mental and magical. And then honestly, I forgot about the final category point. I almost went into high peak without killing the corrupted sandworm, because I felt no need for it, I felt so powerful. But I picked up a healing infusion as the final one, or obviously you could unlock another 3, but I didn't really want Corrosive Blades, so then the other option would be Harmony. But here, you don't need Waters of Life, since you already have a lot of immunity to poisons and diseases. Elemental Harmony is just a whatever talent, and it costs 20 Equilibrium, which is quite a lot for a talent that is not very impactful. One with Nature is really good, but that's the only talent that's good, because Healing Nexus is basically a form of anti-heal that also redirects the healing to you. And I read some people on the forums recommend to take Harmony to deal with enemies that heal a lot, because that is a problem that Oozemancer faces, since your damage is really slow. Enemies with a lot of healing are sometimes hard to take down, but that's where your gear comes in. And specifically for anti-heal, you should always have this totem charm that applies 50% healing reduction, and what you care about here is as short of a cooldown as possible. None of the other stats matter, it doesn't matter how much damage it deals. I think it's always lasting for 7 turns, so all you care about is this cooldown, and you want it as low as possible, just to deal with these enemies that heal a ton. If you run into an enemy that heals a lot and you don't have this, you can also obviously get the poison that reduces healing by 50% through poisonous spores. Now it's only a 1 in 4 chance, but if you try for long enough, you should be able to get it and maybe, perhaps, kill the enemy. Let's first talk about some of the weirder items that I have. So I'm using the Mummified Egg Sac of Angole. This lets you summon 2 spiders. They are fairly tanky, they don't deal that much damage, but they reduce your equilibrium. They count as summons, so if they stand in your mucus, they reduce your equilibrium, they're annoying, they get in the way of enemies, so they felt perfect for my Oozemancer. The only obvious downside is that it reduces your light radius by 2, which is annoying, and it made me run this lantern that literally only gives me light radius, it basically gives no other stats. Yeah, my gear sucks. You're going to see some really bad items. But another item that I have is this Plumpkin, okay? And this is from the special event that is running right now, where you get chased by ghosts and then you unlock this special zone. My advice, don't do this. This is a word of advice for any zone if you're playing on Insane, because they can be pretty overtuned. And, I mean, this zone wasn't that overtuned, but the downside is most of the enemies are undead, so they are immune to poison, and once you enter this zone, you cannot leave. You cannot teleport out with your recall, you're just stuck until you kill the boss. And at a few points in this zone, I honestly thought that I'm going to die. So right now you're looking at the second floor, where you run into the boss. But what I didn't know is that you don't only run into the boss, there's also just a bunch of rares and a random boss and some uniques just standing there, all aggroing onto me right as I enter the floor. And what is supposed to be, you know, a funny event turned into like a life and death situation. The boss itself is a pushover, like the boss is nothing, but the fact that so many enemies can spawn on this zone and it's just an open plain so everything will be able to see you, that is horrifying. And the reward if you win is this item that gives you plus 2% damage mod and then damage against immovable objects, which is irrelevant. And then you can also turn into a pumpkin, which changes your look and gives you Plumpkin Fury, which does a negligible amount of nature damage around you. It's basically useless. And you get plus 10% critical power. So basically it's not really even worth changing into the pumpkin. And then the last item, I think I talked about it last time, but I confirmed just how good this is. The Far Hand. This is an item from the Cultist DLC, the Eldritch Abominations DLC, and it just straight up gives you 100% teleport immunity. And you use this in War Pride, specifically in the entrances in War Pride. You just put this on, because if you don't, the enemies will teleport you out of the starting room, and that can make you pull, you know, every single enemy on the map. So this is 100% worth it if you find it to put it on. And purely just at the beginning. Once you clear out the first room, you can put back on your usual amulet, but for the start, it's very, very good. So the rest of the gear. You are anti-magic, and a lot of the good modifiers, like the Undeterred mod on your boots that gives you stun and confusion immunity, you can't get. You cannot craft rings in the early game, because you can't enter the Mage Town, so it can be tough, depending on your luck. And I felt pretty unlucky. The stats you are looking for is increased nature damage. Penetration you don't have to focus on, since you already get 50% for free, and you will just pick it up on some random parts of your gear. But yeah, increased nature damage, critical chance, mind power, immunities, nothing really out of the ordinary. And then if you go dwarf, getting some saves is very useful. One of the easiest ways to get them is on your rope, where there's a modifier that gives you all three. And then you might wonder if I went defense or armor, because that's what you usually do to try and mitigate physical damage. You either go armor to try and reduce it, or defense to try and dodge it. And I did neither. And this is something that you can get away with on some characters. And since on Oozemancer you should not really be getting hit all that often, since you have all your oozes and all your summons. And then later in the game, you will have a lot of crit shrug off, and you should be really focusing on physical resistance more than usual. You can absolutely get away with not taking much defense or much armor. So my hat is Eye of the Forest. It's a pretty mediocre item. It gives blind immunity, which is nice, but without a doubt you could craft a better hat. My amulet just gives me 2 immunities for confusion and stun. The rest of the stats are again pretty miserable, although willpower, I guess I should have mentioned that willpower is always good. You take it from escorts, you take it on items because it raises your equilibrium threshold, so any willpower increase is also quite valuable. On my cloak I desperately tried to get mind crit, because I just couldn't get it anywhere else, and I only ended up with 70%, which is pretty low, but what can you do? My hands are tier 2, and I think I found them in one of the first dungeons, and I never found anything better. Just 25% increased nature damage is too good to pass up. On my belt, Girdle of Preservation is perfect. Not only it gives you all these beautiful resistances, it even gives you some saves, which are relevant for my character. So if this drops, definitely take it. Oh yeah, on your gloves, what you actually want is the Antimagic gloves, Spellhunt Remnants. If those drop, you should definitely take them. They're just a better version of this, and they let you strip magical sustains. On my boots, I ended up with Eden's Guile, which basically all it does is gives you a big burst of global speed. 66% for 8 turns is very, very good. And since you cannot get the Undeterred mod, you are not even giving up that much. Like, the majority of the stats on boots are pretty whatever. So this felt like a very good trade-off. A Psionic Shield, because it is the best tool. and this one is really good. A lantern that gives me 11 light and nothing else, because Tome just refused to drop any lantern whatsoever. I actually only started using this pretty late. I used this one for most of the game. I at least got 2 orange rings, so I could craft them to be pretty decent. So this gives me a lot of power and some damage mod. And on this one I just solved most of my immunities and got a huge amount of life regen. Like I mentioned, the rope is just a modifier that gives resistances and the one that gives saves. It also gives 90% cold resistance, which is pretty insane. I didn't even know that's possible. And then the Mindstars were a huge struggle. Ultimately what I decided to use them for is to just get a lot of physical resistance, because it just didn't seem like my crit is going to get there. So I instead just opted for more defense, because you really don't need that much. Once you're in the late game, I only have 61% increased nature and the 70 crit chance, but it's more than enough. By the late game I was even killing enemies pretty quickly. And just to make it clear, the amount of damage the Mindstars do is completely irrelevant. I mean, it is a little relevant for Call of the Ooze, which is the only talent that does weapon damage, but you don't really use this to deal damage, you just use this to spawn the Oozes. And other than that, I don't think I've melee attacked since like level 10. I want to talk about autocasting your talents, because what I do on pretty much every single class is that I set my sustains to autocast out of combat. This is generally safe, it's not really ever going to kill you, but other than that, you shouldn't really ever autocast anything else. Even if it's an instant speed talent, autocasting is dangerous, and that is precisely for one reason, the movement infusion. If you perform any other action other than movement, so like using this instant speed moss, it will cancel the movement infusion. And if you have anything on autocast, trust me, it's going to happen. You're going to be running away from a fight, and then some instant talent is going to trigger. You maybe won't even notice it, you're going to keep moving right, but suddenly this will take 2 turns, and you are going to die. So I don't recommend autocasting any instant speed talents, and definitely not any talents that take a full turn. You should never ever do that. That I think is just complete suicide. But on Oozemancer, I actually do autocast some of my talents because I'm lazy and there are a lot of them. And for example, Mucus, I set to just autocasting when enemies are visible, which is basically what you want to do every time, since standing in it will severely improve your equilibrium reduction. So it's, I think, basically optimal to just drop it as soon as you see an enemy. So that is the one talent that I have on autocast, and I have it here on my hotbar, so that anytime I am going to run away with a movement infusion, I make sure to check that this is just not coming off of a cooldown, because otherwise you just die. And another talent that I had on autocast most of the time is Resilience of the Dwarfs, and I have this on enemies are visible and adjacent. This has actually cancelled my movement infusion once this run, and it almost killed me, so it's not the best idea, but I don't have space for it on the hotbar, and I'm too lazy to press it. What I probably should have done is just autocast this when enemies are visible, because it also gives saves, right? Not only armor, but saves, and since it has a massive cooldown, it is extremely unlikely to ever cancel my movement inscription. So that's just something for you to consider. And then there's the question of nature's balance and resetting your cooldowns. What you really want this to hit is Ael's Wrath. Since this stacks, you can cast this right after each other, and both of them will deal damage. So in theory, you could just use Ael's Wrath and instantly reset it, but that feels like kind of a waste, since this can reset the cooldown of up to 7 talents. So what I like to do is use the Nature's Balance after the mosses come off cooldown, because if you use one of the moss talents, it will put itself on cooldown, and also the other 3 mosses. So if I now use Nature's Balance, all 4 of these are a target, and you really don't want to hit these 3 on a 3-turn cooldown. So I use my other talents, and as soon as the mosses come off cooldown, this is where I go for Nature's Balance, and I can usually still hit Ael's Wrath. For the Alchemists, you definitely want class points above generic points. Then I recommend picking up +5 willpower, and after that it's pretty whatever. You can pick up the safe elixir if you are a dwarf, And for the Escorts, you want willpower whenever possible. Thankfully, since you are anti-magic, you basically always have access to willpower. I managed to save every single Escort, and I got 3 times Constitution and willpower everywhere else. And the willpower is just so that the equilibrium threshold is as high as possible. So yeah, that's my take on Oozemancer. I was pleasantly surprised at just how much effort I had to put in to surviving. Usually these S-tier best classes, they might be fun, but they're not very challenging. You usually know for like more than half of the game that you've basically already won. And on Oozemancer I felt like there were some dips in the power level, and it also just took me a while to figure out exactly when to use certain talents, because it is quite a different class from everything else. So it's pretty cool. For the next class I want to play a Doom Elf Corruptor. At least it sounds really fun in my head. That is probably what I will talk about next. I hope this was helpful, and thanks for watching.